Oh, I thought I was going to belch a lot louder than that. 1 and 2 and 1, 2, 3, 4. Do do ba beep ba ba ba. Razzmatazz taz 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 do. The Pics that refreshes. Okay, sorry. Good morning. I am rather exhausted. Thank you for asking. I record this. It's Wednesday morning, and I will not be going into the funny book store today nor tomorrow, for I have gone in every day for the last 7 days. Had to. The owner was out of town last week, so I was already going to have to be there a couple days by myself. But then one of my coworkers fell ill, or not as well. She also went out of town, but to an unhealthy area, more conceptually speaking. So I wasn't completely by myself. And John, it's it's always been a dream of mine to work full time in a comic book store, but I also always have to have a coworker named John. This was true in San Diego as it is in Van. So I have been spending the morning just trying to catch up on stuff. I don't know if I'll get to read all of this week's comics, but I think I should have time. Um, but I guess we'll have to find out next week. Tune in then, won't you? Thank you. I don't know how annoying that is. I also clearly don't care. But anyways, I'm in my underpants. It's time to do Picks of the Week. First up, Bill and Ted Roll the Dice, #1. This is from Opus. Their guess is as good as mine, but it has writing by James Asmus, who I was actually just kind of wondering about the other day. Back in the mid-teens, mid to early late teens, I'm thinking 2014 to 2017 in there, Marvel Comics really made a push to make the Inhumans more popular. The X-Men have long been, the mutants, have long been the most popular property in the Marvel universe, but at the time they were in no danger of becoming a film franchise. Not for Marvel. There was obviously still the Fox movies. So as in their editorial wisdom, they made a real push in the comics themselves to make the Inhumans kind of replace the mutants. That kind of went by the boards, especially once Disney bought Fox and it was no longer an issue. Thanks, capitalism. Finally shook out for me in this regard. But I bring all that up because when they gave the Inhumans their own comics, I think there was All New Inhumans and Uncanny Inhumans. James Asmus wrote one, if not both of those. But now he's writing by my count, third Bill and Ted comic book adaptation. There was the original Marvel Bill and Ted's excellent comic book, which came out after the second movie. First, is right around in there. And that was written and drawn by Evan Dorkin. And then I don't think there's been another one until the couple years ago, when the third Bill and Ted movie, Bill and Ted Face the Music, came out. There was something of a prequel to that, also written by Evan Dorkin and drawn by Roger Langridge, called Bill and Ted Get Another Comic Book. I can't remember the name of it now. And now this one here, which has nothing, Evan Dorkin has nothing to do with it, apparently. And as we can also see, this is implied by the title and by the cover that it's something of a Dungeons and Dragons adventure for our two young San Demons. So I'm assured is what they call people from San Dimas. Oh, and if I haven't made that clear, this is an adaptation from the film Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, using characters from therein. Now, I've always been a big fan. I was a little kid when the first one came out. I want to say 9 or 10, maybe even 11 or 12. And I saw Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey in the theaters in But it's a goofier, property. But I just have always enjoyed it. All right, good. Also this week I got Do a Powerbomb #1. This is written and drawn by Daniel Warren Johnson, who I believe I mentioned not too long ago when he did Beta Ray Bill solo series. But he's done a lot of other really great indie books. This is where he cut his teeth, really. And I just have always been I'm a big fan of his work. And this is also a book about professional wrestling, which I am not quite the fan of professional wrestling that I was as a lad, but I still do enjoy it, and I enjoy stories, especially comics around it. Wrestling only seems to have gotten bigger and bigger since I kind of stopped paying attention. My golden years were a lot of people's golden years, which is to say the 80s and early 90s. Mostly the 80s, though. No, I think until when I was really, really, really hardcore, when I was like buying wrestling magazines and begging my parents to get pay-per-view, that would have been 89, 90, 91 in there. Actually, really just 89, 90. And then it kind of petered out. But, I mean, it's only ever been... when I was in my early 20s, I had a roommate who was still very into it, even though by that point I had definitely lost interest because it had gotten more reality TV-like everything else on television back then. Oh, thank you for tuning into Old Man Complains about how things used to be. And then, it's certainly within the last few years, I've noticed that a lot of my colleagues in stand-up comedy are big wrestling guys, which I think only kind of makes sense. A very funny and talented comedian, Hunter Roberts, out of the great state of Tennessee, the volunteer state, does a bit where he will if you name any WrestleMania, he can name you the headlining match, which doesn't sound that impressive and honestly isn't in any kind of real sense, but I was very impressed. And they might not just be WrestleManias. It might be any major WWF or WWE event. I don't know how they do it. That's another thing. When I was a kid, there were only... welcome to this new segment called When I Was a Kid. When I was a kid, there were only ever, at most, 4 major wrestling events. WrestleMania was the big one, obviously. Then there was SummerSlam, Royal Rumble, which is my personal favorite, the Survivor Series, and then King of the Ring, I want to say... King of the Ring might have been a cable thing. You might have been able to just watch that. Because for whatever reason, that was not... Nobody gave a shit. I can't even remember now. I can't remember his name, but whoever was King of the Ring when I was a kid wasn't even a wrestler that you saw every week. That was the other thing, is because when I was a kid, you got an hour of wrestling on Saturday morning and another hour on Sunday morning. And then when they came up with Monday Night Raw, I was like, wait a minute. You mean to tell me that there are 2 hours of prime time professional wrestling on basic cable that I can watch every week? And that kept me going for a while yet. And it was like the Monday Night Raw back then too, and I don't know how it is now. It was like marquee stuff. It wasn't. It were matches that you would normally have to wait to see on pay-per-view. But then it wasn't long after that they introduced WWF In Your House, which became like a monthly pay-per-view event. And then it has that thing, like a lot of things do, when everything's an event, then nothing is an event. So, and it also that was the last era that professional wrestling had Mean Gene Okerlund interview wrestlers, and they would yell at the camera, and then that was you know what I mean? And then it went from that to more, like I said, more of a reality TV thing where you were like a fly on the wall in the locker room while shenanigans are going down. I just lost interest. I think it's one of those things too where, and again, I hate to use this phrase, but you just kind of grow out of it in a little bit of a way. I wish I still enjoyed it as much as I did, because boy, I loved it. It was so much fun, and it still is. I went back and not too long ago watched the first 10 WrestleManias. I guess this would have been about 10 years ago, but yeah, they held up. I still really enjoyed myself. Do a powerbomb. And finally this week, oh boy, the Bone Orchard Mythos: The Passageway by Lemire and Andreas Solentino. This is a Lemire and Solentino are a great, great, great creative team. Jeff Lemire has been a favorite writer and artist of mine for about 12, 13 years. And he and Sorrentino, I believe, first teamed up on Green Arrow, and this would have been about 10 years ago. And they did Gideon Falls together, and I want to say they've done at least one other project. They've sort of been apparently taking a page. I haven't read up on this. Why would I bother researching anything? Sort of taking a page out of Brubaker and Phillips' book and are now doing a series of standalone hardcover graphic novels. This isn't as thick as the Reckless books have been, but it's also not as expensive. $18 for this is a really nice hardcover. So it's going to be it's a series of horror comics that are all connected. I think like with Reckless though, you don't need to read them all. Like they do stand alone. And the Bone Orchard mythos is the overall title. Now I'm pretty sure Bone Orchard is a song, a lyric reference, and I'm not sure what it is, but I don't really care because the main thing is that in one of the best episodes of Mystery Science Theater 3000, which would be episode 822, Overdrawn the Memory Bank, the character Professor Bobo makes a reference, and he says towards the end of the episode, he says the line, "You don't want to end up in the Bone Orchard, man." And so now I get to say that out loud every time I see or think of this. As that one line, it's almost he's not even on camera when he says it, so it's one of those lines. It's definitely like a throwaway, but it just makes me laugh. Like most the funniest lines on that show. So I don't know much. It looks scary, doesn't it? As a hand with a weird thing in the palm of such a. I don't like purposefully do not want to know. Oh, Primordial also. I was trying to think of something they might have done between Green Arrow and Gideon Falls, and I don't think there is. So that'll be fun, right, kids? Pixel. And now, Pixel last week. I only got to read them this morning. As I mentioned, I've been rather busy indeed. Ugh! But I did get some reading. First up, Justice Warriors #1. This was not only what I was expecting, but it was what I was expecting, but way more of it, and I'm very happy for it. This takes place in the far-flung future where there's a bubble city. This is called Bubble City beneath this dome to protect its denizens from the elements, and then there's the uninhabited zone outside of that, where the Justice Warriors, the police, are there to police things. Now we have our main character is Swamp Cop. He doesn't have a proper name. There's a lot of mutants. This is his officer. This is his partner, Officer Shit, and it's really goofy. It's very over the top. It's clearly very much a parody of RoboCop and that sort of 80s and 90s science fiction action stuff. Very much shoot first and ask questions later. It's very, very tongue in cheek, very satirical, and I enjoy that too. So it's like you get the best of both worlds, which is sort of like how RoboCop was. RoboCop was an over the top action movie, but it also was very satirical and very much. I mean, you have to kind of look for it, but it's there. In the first movie, certainly. I can't speak to the rest of the franchise. Actually, I can speak to the rest of the franchise, and it stinks. Justice Warriors does not stink. I read 78 MPH. This was really fun, too. This was, as I said last week, it's the. So I guess I don't spoil too much, but in the not too distant future, climate scientists are trying to reverse everything that's happening. They think, oh, well, we have a way to fix the hole in the ozone layer. We're going to release this gas or whatever it is to fix the hole in the ozone layer. And it does do that, but also it turns the atmosphere into a magnifying glass. And so, like ants at the whim of a cruel boy, we are being fried by the sun now. So, as I mentioned, they figure out that if they can just keep moving at 78 miles per hour minimum, the sun will never catch up to them. And yes, there are continental highways in this future. So a lot of fun. Creative team I've never heard of before, and the art is not like, as we'll see with another book I got here. Art is not tremendous, but it's definitely better than you would expect. It's definitely better than what I would expect from this indie. This is from Red 5, who are kind of still hanging in there, but I think ever since they stopped doing Atomic Robo, which I'm only assuming was kind of their flagship title because it was the only one I ever bought. Um, yeah, but I mean, it's good. I look forward to more from this, not only the series but from these creators, whose names I still don't know, even though you just watched me open the book. I also read Poison Ivy #1. This was a lot of fun too. This was Ivy's up to her old tricks, trying to eliminate humanity in the name of botany, and who could blame her? There's also something of a meal made of her recent split from Harley Quinn, which doesn't really do it for me. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but Harley Quinn as a character, I just don't much care for. I don't hate. I find her fun. I think Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn is perfect delight. I enjoy her acting very much, just in general, largely because she was in Wolf of Wall Street. But I do genuinely, she's very easy on the eyes, that gal, and I enjoy her as Harley Quinn. I think she plays a very good Harley Quinn. But the character itself, just I don't know, man. Like when, and this is gonna sound like again when I was your age, but it's not as much. Harley Quinn was created for the television program Batman the Animated Series, which was an after-school cartoon when I was in high school, and I loved it, loved it, loved it. Still do. It's a great show. They introduced her without any real fanfare. She was just kind of there. She was Joker's girlfriend slash main henchwoman. And for whatever reason, though, and I was kind of like, I remember the time just thinking like, I guess so. If you, it felt like it really felt like I don't, you know what? To be honest with you, I don't know why. I never really understood why they thought they needed another Joker-y character to go along with the Joker. And now that I'm thinking about it, there were definitely, I want to say there were episodes of that show that featured the Joker and not Harley Quinn, but I could be mistaken. But you know, even though I was kind of coolish on her, I could take her or leave her. She hit big. Kevin Smith named his daughter after her. What a weirdo! And um, yeah, characters just. And then when she was introduced into the comics, and I'll tell you this too. Back, it's a little strange because back at San Diego Comics when my buddy Frank owned the shop, which would have been 2012, 2013, 2014 in that era, we couldn't keep a Harley Quinn book on the shelf for anything. Like, you know, we had at least a couple regulars who just snapped up everything, and then a lot of people just coming off the street wanted to know if we had any Harley Quinn comics, and it was hard to keep them in the shop. This shop that I work at now also does not have much of a selection of Harley Quinn comics, though we do have slightly more than the old place did. But also, there's not the demand for it that there was where I used to work, and I don't know if that's a function of locality or time, but that's actually has nothing to do with anything. It was, but Harley has definitely become a very popular character. And then not long ago, I guess it was around that time, about 10 years ago, that they started teaming her up with Poison Ivy, which kind of made sense, just as Batman villainesses. And then they started dating, but I don't know when that happened because I don't read that much DC. What I do know is that a few months ago there was a comic wherein they broke up, and the I might have mentioned this last week. The writer was immediately doxxed, uh, and it's really a bummer in this particular instance too, because from what I didn't delve too deep into it because reading about discussing internet things is just as bad as participating in them, as near as I can tell. But it was fans that were pissed, and it wasn't your typical fan. When Mockingbird had there was this whole thing with Chelsea Kane. This would have been 2015. Who was writing Mockingbird and was unapologetically and extremely in your face about how feminist it was, and she got doxxed by a bunch of Comicsgate jerk offs who are your men's rights activists of the comic book world. But this was, to my understanding, this Harley Quinn Poison Ivy thing was more, from the opposite side of the fence, which is like, you guys, that's not doing us any favors. You're making us look like the stereotypical hysterical nerds that people think we So my apathy on that particular thing is twofold in that I just don't really care about Harley that much. And also, see what happened when they tried to, you know, shake things up a little bit. So yeah, when it comes up in this, I was like, but it's still good. It's G. Willow Wilson. Like I said, I haven't read anything that she's done since Ms. Marvel that I can recall. So it's nice having her back. Poison Ivy is not. I mean, I enjoy the character. I like the character, but she's never been in my top list of villains. But she does have what I consider to be the primary quality of a villain, which is utter and total misanthropy. That's my favorite kind of villain. Poison Ivy hates humanity. It's like, well, maybe I do relate to this character, and then actually is doing something about it. So God bless. I also read this morning Fist of the Dragon #1. This is from Plucky Upstart Advent Comics. There's a second issue planned, but I don't know when this is coming out. It also seemed like the this cover art is dated 2010. There is an ad for the Wounded Warrior Project, which has a copyright date of 2015 on the inside front cover. And then there's a pinup in the back that's dated 2013. So I'm under the impression that this comic has been a long time coming. And it's great. It's very much a tribute to Bruce Lee and his work. The story and setup is very much just Enter the Dragon. The character names are changed in some of the situations, but it's basically Enter the Dragon, which I have zero problem with since I love Enter the Dragon and Bruce Lee. It also is very, and I say this the least insultingly way I can, very high school. Like, the art is not super good, but it is very much of its, I don't want to say era or time, because it also very clearly takes place in the 70s. But it also really rings to me as a very 90s comics nostalgia thing, which is, like, I have no problem with, as I may have mentioned. So even though it takes place in the 70s and Kung Fu is generally thought of as more of a 70s genre, it also does. Kung Fu comics are extremely hard to do, and I've always been, and I really, outside of movies or TV, I think it's a hard genre. It's hard to do in comics. It's hard to do in books. It's a hard thing to do in a static medium. But comics aren't completely static, so it's still. I mean, they, at least to all appearances, are like, they technically are static, but there are ways to indicate motion that are more visual than you get in just the written word. Oh, didn't I go to college? It's just that if you aren't Paul Gulacy, it's nearly impossible to do it that well. Paul Gulacy is the only person I've ever seen. Paul Gulacy drew in the 70s Master of Kung Fu, and he's an incredible artist, but that's definitely his best work. And his ability to depict action on a comics page is jaw dropping, as far as I'm concerned. But I guess it's not really fair to hold anyone else up to Paul Gulacy, but it's just always going to happen. And also this week, I started this a while ago, but I finally finished Astro City Metro Book 1. This is great stuff. This is, since Astro City is, I don't think I showed this before, but when I bought it, but not too long ago, a couple months ago, there was the Astro City That Was Then special, and this was released concurrently with that. Since Astro City is going to be starting up again as a monthly book, they've been releasing so this is the first, like, essentially 20 issues of Astro City. There's been many different series and a lot of one-shots and mini series, and those will be in the next book. And I haven't read any of them in years. I had most every issue of Astro City. I kind of got bored with it, frankly, during the Vertigo era, which would have been, again, like early to mid-teens. But now, I mean, if they're going to reprint everything, or maybe I can just track down the issues that I didn't get, but who knows. So this is, as I may have mentioned, this is essentially Kurt Busiek and Brant Anderson's version of the Marvel and DC universe smashed together. Here you see Samaritan, who's very much the Superman character. You have the Confessor back here, who's very much a Batman character. They're very different, but they're very recognizable as analogs. And the important thing with any of these, and I've mentioned this a million times, like meta superhero stuff is really my thing. Ever since Watchmen really kind of opened the door to it. So you have a lot of these now. You have the Black Hammer universe by Jeff Lemire and various artists. You have The Boys, which is a disgusting version of a superhero that Marvel and DC put together, but it still counts. It's still very. The comic is much more about comics than the show is, oddly enough. But yeah, and then there's also like smaller things like Rob Liefeld had a character named Supreme, which was basically a Superman ripoff. And so at one point, Alan Moore basically wrote a bunch of Superman comics, but with Supreme, so he could do the stories that he had wanted to do, similar to Mark Wade's Irredeemable. Mark Wade and Peter Krause, I want to say, did Irredeemable, which was about Superman going insane, basically. Um, which also it was in tandem with a series called Incorruptible, which was about a villain who Irredeemable is not as one to one, but I mean Astro City is not one to one. When I say it's Marvel and DC combined, it very much is. You see a lot of very similar characters, but they all are like the Confessor is not Batman. There's a very different direction that character story goes, but still very recognizable as a Batman sort of pastiche. And I can't say it enough. It's the sort of thing that comic book nerds really like. I would recommend it to people who don't read superhero comics because I think it would be fun. And it's also because a lot of the stories are told completely outside of the hero and villain's perspectives. Usually told, not necessarily, because there's a couple issues that are narrated by Jack in the Box, and Alter Boy, who's the Confessor's sidekick, narrates a few issues. But that's the thing, is he jumps from point of view character, depending on the story. And a lot of the time, it's also the point of view character is somebody who's just a citizen of Astro City. So there's just stories about people who just moved to Astro City for the first time, people who are just visiting, and people who live there, and you get all these different perspectives, and it's a real interesting. It's like that thing where one of the reasons Watchmen was so good is because it really kind of depicted a reality where the superheroes would exist. Like, what would it really look like? And Astro City is still pretty fantastical. It's like Astro City does present a very realistic view of superheroes, but it's not cynical. I mean, there are some. It's still so yeah. It's still very escapist, but it's still realistic. It's realistic escapism. There we go. That's why I think I like this sort of thing. Oh, and that was Pixeless. Okay, good. For some reason, I thought I hadn't started the second half of this, and it was already a half hour in. No, it's Pixeless. Okay, I'm gonna go read some more comic books now. Isn't this fun? It's fun.